The spear whistled past Ethan Cross's ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air against his frozen cheek. Snow exploded around his boots as he dove behind the twisted wreckage of what had once been a research station's communication array. His breath came in sharp puffs of white vapor that hung in the Arctic air for barely a second before the howling wind tore them away. "Sold for meat, human. Hold me, use me. Just get me out of here," the voice cried out again, raw with desperation and something that cut deeper than the sub-zero temperature. It was a female voice, but not quite human. The accent was strange, musical yet harsh, like wind through broken glass. Ethan pressed his back against the cold metal and gripped his salvaged knife tighter. The blade was barely 6 inches long, more suited for opening ration packs than fighting. But it was all he had left after 3 days of running across this godforsaken, frozen wasteland. Through a gap in the debris, he watched the hunting party drag their prizes toward the cages. There were 6 hunters, all humanoid but wrong in ways that made his skin crawl. Their limbs were too long, joints bending at impossible angles, and their movements had a predatory fluidity that spoke of perfect adaptation to this hostile world. They wore crude armor fashioned from the hides of local beasts and carried weapons that looked primitive but deadly effective. Spears with serrated bone tips, clubs studded with what looked like teeth, curved blades that gleamed with a dark, oily sheen that spoke of poison or corruption. But it wasn't the hunters that made Ethan's stomach clench with rage. It was their cargo. The cages were cobbled together from scavenged metal and wire, barely large enough for their occupants to crouch inside. Most held creatures he didn't recognize, things with too many eyes or limbs covered in scales that shifted color in the strange light of this planet's twin suns. But in the largest cage, the one they were dragging toward what looked like a makeshift auction block, was something that made his breath catch. She was humanoid, definitely sentient, with features that were hauntingly beautiful despite the terror etched across them. Her skin was a pale blue that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, and her hair was silver white, hanging in matted tangles around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were silver too, bright as mercury, and filled with a desperate intelligence that spoke directly to something primal in his chest. "Fresh meat here," one of the hunters growled in heavily accented English, apparently for the benefit of the mixed crowd gathering around the auction block. Blue-skinned female, young, strong, good for work or food. The creature inside the cage pressed herself against the bars, and Ethan could see the tremor in her hands as she gripped the metal. She was wearing what had once been some kind of bodysuit, but it was torn and stained with blood and mud. Fresh wounds marked her arms and face, and one ankle was swollen, suggesting she'd tried to run and failed. "Please," she whispered, and her voice carried on the wind to where Ethan crouched. "Not like this. Not like the others." Ethan had seen the bones scattered around the camp when he'd first spotted the hunting party from the ridge above, picked clean and cracked open for marrow. Some were recognizably humanoid, others weren't. All told the same story about what happened to those who ended up in those cages. He should run. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to slip away while the hunters were distracted, to make it back to the emergency shelter he'd spotted 2 kilometers north, to survive until the rescue ship arrived. If it arrived, the distress beacon he'd managed to activate 3 days ago after the research station's reactor went critical might not even be working. For all he knew, he was the last human on this planet. The smart play was survival. His survival. But those silver eyes found his hiding spot with uncanny accuracy, as if she could sense his presence. For a moment, their gazes locked across 20 meters of wind-scoured ice, and he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not just fear, though there was plenty of that. Not just desperation, though that was there too. What he saw was a kind of resigned dignity, the look of someone who had accepted that they were going to die but refused to go quietly. It reminded him of the way his sister had looked at the end, when the cancer had taken everything from her except her refusal to give up fighting. Jessica had died 3 years before he had volunteered for this mission, but seeing that same fierce defiance in an alien face on a world light years from Earth made something snap into place in his head. "Bidding starts at 50 units, the hunter called out, and several figures in the crowd raised crude tokens or strips of colored cloth. 50 for the blue skin. "Who gives 60? Ethan moved. He didn't have a plan beyond the knife in his hand and the element of surprise. The hunters were focused on their auction, their backs to the wreckage field where he had been hiding. He sprinted across the open ground in a low crouch, using the howling wind to mask the sound of his boots on the hard-packed snow. The first hunter never saw him coming. Ethan's blade found the gap between neck and shoulder, slipping between improvised armor plates to sever something vital. The creature dropped without a sound, purple blood steaming in the cold air. The second hunter turned just in time to catch Ethan's shoulder in his midsection. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and weapons rolling across the ice-slick ground. The hunter was stronger, but Ethan was desperate and fighting for someone else's life as much as his own. He got his knife up just as clawed fingers went for his throat, and the blade opened the hunter's forearm to the bone. A roar of rage split the air as the other hunters realized what was happening. Spears and clubs swung toward him, but Ethan was already rolling away, putting the cage between himself and the weapons. His fingers found the latch mechanism, some kind of twisted wire closure, and wrenched it open. "Can you run?" he shouted at the blue-skinned woman as the cage door swung wide. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she exploded out of the cage like a compressed spring, her injured ankle apparently forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. She moved with a fluid grace that made the hunters look clumsy by comparison, snatching up a fallen spear in one smooth motion and spinning it to catch an attacker across the face with the butt end. "This way!" Ethan yelled, pointing toward the debris field. "Move!" They ran together across the uneven ground, leaping over twisted metal and ducking under dangling cables. Behind them, the hunters gave chase with angry howls that sounded like nothing Ethan ever wanted to hear again. A spear skittered off the ice beside his feet, close enough to trip him if he'd been a step slower. The debris field gave way to open tundra, a rolling expanse of white broken only by occasional outcroppings of dark rock. Here there was no cover, nothing to break the wind or hide their heat signatures from pursuit. Ethan's lungs burned as they climbed a steep slope, his breath coming in harsh gasps that formed ice crystals in his beard. The woman beside him was breathing hard too, but she moved with an economy of motion that suggested she was built for this kind of terrain. Her bare feet found purchase on surfaces where his boots slipped, and she helped pull him up the steeper sections without being asked. "There," she said, pointing toward a structure barely visible through the blowing snow. "Shelter." It was another piece of wreckage, bigger than the communication array he'd hidden behind. Part of a ship's hull, maybe, or a section of the research station that had been blown clear when the reactor went critical. The metal was scorched black and twisted, but it would block the wind and hide their thermal signatures from the hunters' tracking skills. They slid through a gap in the hull just as the first spear clattered against the outer wall. Inside, the space was cramped but dry, filled with the sharp scent of ozone and burned electronics. Ethan found what looked like a ventilation grate and wedged his knife blade through the slats to prop it open. Cold air flowed in, but it was better than suffocating. "They'll track us," the woman said, settling against the opposite wall. Her voice was steady now, though he could see her hands shaking. "Heat trail, scent. They're good hunters." "Then we keep moving," Ethan replied, checking the makeshift barricade he'd created across the entrance. "Rest for a few minutes, then find another hiding spot." She studied him in the dim light filtering through cracks in the hull. "Why did you help me?" It was a fair question, and one he wasn't sure he could answer honestly. "Because you needed help." "That's not a reason." "That's an excuse." Her silver eyes narrowed. "Humans don't help others without wanting something in return." "I know this." The bitter certainty in her voice hit him like a physical blow. "What do you know about humans?" "Enough." She shifted position, wincing as her weight settled on her injured ankle. "Your people came to our world 3 cycles ago. They said they wanted to trade, to learn from each other. My father believed them. He was elder chief of the Northlands then. Was? Dead now, all dead. Your people didn't want to trade. They wanted land, resources, workers who could survive in harsh conditions." She touched one of the wounds on her arm, fresh blood still seeping through the torn fabric of her suit. "They took what they wanted and left the rest of us to the scavengers." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. But her tone had lost some of its edge, as if she was talking more to herself than to him. "You're not like the others, though. You fought to free me, not to claim me." "There's a difference." A sound that might have been laughter escaped her throat, though there was no humor in it. The others who helped me always wanted payment. My body, my labor, my knowledge of this world's dangers. You haven't asked for any of those things. I'm not going to. She tilted her head, studying him with those unsettling silver eyes. Then what do you want from me? The question hung in the cold air between them, and Ethan realized he didn't have a good answer. What did he want? To get off this planet alive, obviously. To find some way to contact the rescue ship if it was still coming. To survive long enough to see Earth again, or at least die somewhere warmer than this frozen wasteland. But looking at this woman, this alien who had every reason to hate him and his entire species, he found himself thinking about something else entirely. About the way she'd moved when he opened her cage, not fleeing immediately but turning to fight beside him. About the dignity in her voice even when she was begging for help. About the fact that despite everything she'd been through, she was still capable of trusting a human enough to follow him into hiding. I want to get both of us out of this alive, he said finally. That's all. She considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My name is Arya. Ethan. Ethan. She pronounced it carefully as if testing the weight of the syllables. This shelter won't hide us for long. The hunters have devices that track heat in motion. Old human technology, probably taken from your people's camps. How long do we have? Maybe an hour. Less if they're smart enough to split up and search multiple paths. Ethan checked his knife, then looked around the cramped shelter for anything else they could use as weapons. There were some loose pieces of metal that might serve as clubs, and what looked like a broken antenna that could work as a spear shaft. Not much against 6 trained hunters, but better than nothing. You said your people knew this world's dangers, he said, prying a promising piece of shrapnel free from the wall. What are we dealing with out there besides the hunters? Cold that can freeze flesh in minutes if you're not prepared. Winds that can knock you down and bury you in snow before you can get back up. Crevasses that drop for hundreds of meters into ice caves where things live that haven't seen daylight in centuries. Arya tested the weight of a metal rod, then set it aside in favor of a longer piece with jagged edges. And that's just the natural hazards. What about the unnatural ones? Her smile was grim. The research station your people built. It didn't just explode by accident. There are things in the deep ice that should have been left alone. Things that have been sleeping for a very long time. A chill ran down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sleeping things? Your people called them parasites. We had other names, older names. Arya moved to the entrance and peered through a crack in their makeshift barricade. They're drawn to warmth, to electrical activity. When the station's reactor went critical, it probably woke up half the hive. Hive? Before Arya could answer, a sound echoed across the tundra outside. It started low, like wind through a cave, then rose to become something between a howl and a scream. It was answered from another direction, then another, until the air was full of inhuman voices calling to each other through the storm. Those aren't the hunters, Ethan said. No. Arya backed away from the entrance, her silver eyes wide. Those are the sleepers. And they're hungry. The voices grew closer, and with them came a new sound. Scratching, scraping, something moving across the ice with claws or teeth or both. Multiple somethings, from the sound of it, converging on their position from several directions at once. The heat, Arya whispered. Our body heat drew them here. They can sense it from kilometers away. Ethan gripped his knife tighter and moved to stand beside her. How do we fight them? You don't fight them. You run or you die. There is no middle ground. The scratching sounds grew louder, and now Ethan could hear something else. A wet, sliding noise, like something boneless, moving across rough surfaces. Whatever was out there, it was big, bigger than the hunters who had been chasing them. The back wall, Arya said suddenly, pointing toward the rear of their shelter. There's a gap large enough to crawl through. We can get out without them seeing us. Ethan looked where she was pointing and saw she was right. The hull had been twisted when it crashed, creating a space just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond it, he could see more wreckage, pieces of debris that would provide cover for at least a few dozen meters. What about the hunters? They'll be dealing with the sleepers now. If we're smart and quiet, we can slip past while they're distracted. The scratching sounds were directly outside now, accompanied by a new smell that made Ethan's stomach turn. It was the smell of decay, but wrong somehow. Sweet and cloying where it should have been sharp and nauseating. The smell of something that had been dead for a very long time, but was somehow still moving. They squeezed through the gap one at a time, Arya going first with a fluid grace that made it look easy, then Ethan with considerably less dignity. The space was tighter than it had looked, and his jacket caught on a piece of twisted metal that nearly trapped him halfway through. By the time he was clear, his heart was hammering against his ribs and sweat was freezing in his beard despite the cold. The wreckage field beyond their shelter was a maze of debris from the research station's destruction. Pieces of hull plating created narrow corridors between walls of twisted metal and sparking electronics. Overhead, severed cables swayed in the wind like the rigging of a ghost ship, and the whole area hummed with residual energy from damaged power systems. Arya moved through this maze like she'd been born to it, her bare feet finding silent purchase on surfaces that would have betrayed Ethan's presence in seconds. She stayed low, using the debris for cover, and gestured for him to follow her lead. They moved in single file through the wreckage, pausing every few meters to listen for signs of pursuit. Behind them, the sounds of conflict grew louder. Roars of anger and pain mixed with inhuman shrieks that made Ethan's skin crawl. Something heavy crashed into metal, with enough force to shake the ground beneath their feet, and purple light flashed between the gaps in the debris like lightning. "The hunters are using energy weapons," Arya whispered when they paused in the shadow of an overturned cargo container. "Plasma dischargers probably. They'll be effective against one or two sleepers, but not a whole swarm." "How many are we talking about?" "Depends on how long they've been breeding in the ice. Could be dozens, could be hundreds." She tested the air with her nose, a gesture that looked instinctive. "The scent is getting stronger. We need to move faster." They emerged from the wreckage field into open tundra again, but this time Arya led them toward a series of ice ridges that offered better cover than the flat plains. The ridges were formed by some geological process Ethan didn't understand, creating natural walls and channels that broke up the endless white expanse. The going was harder here, with loose ice that shifted under their feet and hidden crevasses that had to be carefully navigated. But it was also quieter, muffling the sounds of their passage and providing multiple escape routes if they were discovered. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when Arya suddenly stopped, one hand raised in a warning gesture. Ethan froze beside her, straining his ears for whatever had caught her attention. At first he heard nothing but wind, then faintly came the sound of voices, human voices, speaking in English with what sounded like military discipline. "Sweep pattern 7, one voice said, distorted by distance and the wind. "Check every piece of cover big enough to hide a person." "Thermal scans are showing multiple heat signatures," another voice replied. "Hard to tell which ones are human?" "Then we check them all. Orders are to bring back the research team alive if possible, but information about what happened here is the priority." Ethan felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. Rescue team. They'd come for him, for whatever was left of the research station's crew. All he had to do was reveal himself, and this nightmare would be over. He started to rise from their hiding place, but Arya's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "Those are my people," he hissed back. "They came to rescue me. Listen to what they're really saying." Ethan strained his ears, and this time he caught the undertone in the voices. The casual way they discussed bringing people back if possible. The emphasis on gathering information rather than preserving lives. The systematic, methodical approach that spoke of a military operation rather than a search and rescue mission. "Information about what happened here is the priority," the first voice repeated. "The research data is worth more than any individual survivor." "What about the natives? Are we authorized to engage?" "Only if they pose a threat to the mission. Otherwise, observe and record. Command wants to know how they survived the outbreak." Arya's grip on his arm tightened. "Your people," she said quietly, "but not here to help you." Ethan felt something cold and bitter settle in his chest. He thought about the research station, about the experiments they'd been conducting on samples taken from the deep ice, about the warnings from the local population that had been ignored in favor of scientific curiosity, about the way his colleagues had talked about the native species as if they were lab animals rather than sentient beings. They're here for the beta, he realized, the research files, and they want to know what we learned before the station was destroyed. And if they find you, he considered this. A surviving member of the research team would be valuable, but only as long as he could provide useful information. Once he'd been debriefed, once every detail had been extracted and recorded, he would become a liability. Someone who had seen too much, who might ask uncomfortable questions about what had really happened on this frozen world. They'd take me back to Earth, he said slowly. Eventually. In chains? The question hit harder than it should have, partly because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. The rescue team sounded professional, but there was something in their tone that suggested this wasn't a standard operation. Something that suggested there were secrets to protect and loose ends to tie up. Maybe, he admitted. They listened to the search team work their way through the debris field, methodical and thorough. Professional soldiers doing a professional job. Ethan found himself studying Arya's profile as she tracked their movement by sound, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her fingers gripped her makeshift spear. She could run, he realized, right now while the soldiers were distracted by their search. She could slip away through the ice channels and disappear into the wilderness, leaving him to face whatever consequences came from being found. It would be the smart play, the survival choice. Instead, she stayed beside him in their hiding place, listening to voices that represented everything her people had learned to fear about humanity. There's another way, she said quietly. What? Away from here, away from the soldiers, the hunters, the sleepers. She pointed toward the horizon where the twin suns were beginning to set behind banks of storm clouds. There's an old beacon stationed in the mountains, pre-human construction, but with technology that might still work. How far? 3 days' walk if the weather holds. 5 if we hit storms. She looked at him directly, those silver eyes serious. It won't be easy. The mountains are even colder than here, and there are other dangers. But there might be a way off this world that doesn't involve your people or mine. Ethan thought about the voices in the wind, about the casual way the soldiers discussed the value of individual lives versus mission objectives, about the research data they were so eager to recover, and the lengths they might go to protect the secrets it contained. Then he thought about the way Arya had moved when he opened her cage, turning to fight beside him rather than simply fleeing to safety. About the trust it must have taken for her to follow him into hiding, and the choice she was making now to offer him a path that didn't lead back to the people who had destroyed her world. Lead the way, he said. They moved carefully through the ice channels, keeping the ridges between themselves and the sounds of the search team. The soldiers were thorough but predictable, following standard patterns that suggested they were more familiar with urban environments than Arctic wilderness. Their thermal scanners would be less effective in the cold, and their heavy equipment would slow them down on the uneven terrain. Still, it took more than an hour to work their way clear of the immediate search area. By the time they reached open ground again, both suns had set and the temperature was dropping fast. The storm clouds Arya had pointed out were closer now, bringing the promise of wind and snow that would make travel even more dangerous. We need shelter for the night, Arya said as they paused at the base of the foothills that marked the beginning of the mountain range. Somewhere we can make fire without the light being seen. She led him to what looked like a natural cave in the rocky hillside. But as they got closer, Ethan realized it was artificial. The opening was too regular, the walls too smooth. Someone had carved this space from the living rock, and not recently. The tool marks were weathered by centuries of wind and ice. Your people? He asked as they ducked inside. Older. Much older. Arya ran her hand along one of the carved walls, tracing symbols that looked like no human writing system Ethan had ever seen. This whole range is full of places like this. Ruins of a civilization that was already ancient when my people first came to this world. The cave extended back into the hillside for perhaps 50 meters, widening into a chamber large enough to stand upright. The floor was covered with a layer of sand that had blown in over the centuries, but underneath, Ethan could see more carved symbols arranged in complex patterns. Who were they? No one knows. They left no bodies, no clear records of their language or culture, just empty spaces carved into stone and metal, and sometimes machines that still work after all this time. Arya knelt beside a depression in the floor and began gathering the loose sand into a pile. The beacon station I mentioned is one of their constructions. If we can reach it, if it's still functional, it might be able to send a message to ships passing through this system. What kind of ships? Traders, smugglers, anyone who doesn't ask too many questions about passengers who want to disappear. She produced what looked like a piece of flint from somewhere in her torn clothing and began striking sparks into the sand. There are places in the galaxy where humans and my people can live side by side without the politics of our homeworlds mattering. The sparks caught something in the sand, and a small flame flickered to life. Not wood or any combustible material Ethan recognized, but some kind of chemical reaction that produced steady heat and light without smoke. The flame was blue-white, almost the same color as Arya's skin, and it cast strange shadows on the carved walls. "How do you know about places like that?" he asked, settling down across the small fire from her. "Because I've been trying to reach them for 3 cycles." She held her hands over the flame, and for the first time since he'd seen her in the cage, some of the tension left her shoulders. "Ever since the first human ships arrived and my world started dying." 3 years, Ethan said, doing the mental conversion. "You've been running for 3 years. Running, hiding, fighting when I had to. Learning to survive in a galaxy that doesn't want my people to exist." The flame reflected in her silver eyes, making them seem to glow from within. "I was on a transport ship heading for the outer systems when the engine failed and we crashed on this world. The other passengers were killed in the crash, but I survived long enough for the hunters to find me." "I'm sorry. You keep saying that." There was no accusation in her voice, just weariness. "Why do you humans always apologize for things you didn't do?" It was a fair question, and one that made him think about his own motivations in ways he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Because someone should, I guess. Because saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but not saying it feels like accepting that what happened was okay. Arya considered this for a moment. "Your people destroyed my world, enslaved or killed most of my people, and drove the survivors into exile. But you risked your life to free me from a cage, and you're sitting here now sharing warmth with someone who has every reason to kill you in your sleep. Why?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because you remind me of someone I cared about. Maybe because I've seen enough death and I'm tired of it. Maybe because doing the right thing shouldn't depend on what species you belong to." The right thing. Arya poked at the flame with a piece of metal, sending up a shower of sparks that flickered and died in the cold air. "That's very human, dividing everything into right and wrong. How do your people see it? Balance, action and consequence. You help someone, they owe you a debt. You harm someone, they have the right to harm you in return. You save a life, that life belongs to you until the debt is paid." She looked at him across the fire. "By freeing me from the Paribet, you created an imbalance. I owe you my life. I don't want your life." "Then what do you want?" The same question she'd asked before, but somehow it felt different now. More personal, more dangerous. "I want to survive," he said. "I want to get off this planet and find somewhere I can live without looking over my shoulder every day. I want to sleep in a warm bed and eat food that doesn't come out of a ration pack." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "I want to know that freeing you was worth the risk." "And how will you know that?" "When we're both somewhere safe." She smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, making her look younger and somehow more alien at the same time. "You really don't understand the debt you've created, do you? Explain it to me. My life belongs to you now until I can save yours in return. But if we both survive, if we both find safety, then the debt is paid and we're equals again." The smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "But if only one of us survives, then the debt passes to the next generation. My children would owe a debt to your children and their children after them. That seems like a hell of a burden to pass on." "It is, which is why most people are very careful about who they choose to save." The fire crackled between them, and outside the cave, wind began to howl as the storm system moved in from the west. Snow started to fall, visible through the cave entrance as white specks that danced in the wind before disappearing into the darkness. "Tell me about the beacon station," Ethan said, partly to change the subject and partly because he needed to understand what they were walking into. It's built into the peak of the highest mountain in this range. The ancients who constructed it used materials that don't decay, don't rust, don't break down over time. The power source is still active after thousands of years. Arya fed another handful of sand into the fire, keeping the flame steady. But the path to reach it is dangerous. Narrow ledges cut into cliff faces, bridges made of metal that might not hold our weight. And that's assuming the weather doesn't kill us first. What about the things that live up there? Her pause told him more than words could have. What makes you think anything lives up there? You said there were other dangers. Natural hazards don't require that kind of warning. The cold keeps most predators at lower altitudes, she said carefully, but not all of them. There are things in the high peaks that hunt by scent and sound, things that have learned to use the wind and the snow as weapons. More sleepers? No, worse, the sleepers are parasites dependent on host organisms for survival. What lives in the mountains are apex predators. They hunt because they choose to, not because they have to. Ethan absorbed this information while listening to the wind outside grow stronger. The storm was definitely moving in, which would make a travel impossible for at least the next day. That gave them time to rest and plan, but it also gave the search team time to expand their perimeter and the hunters time to regroup after their encounter with the sleepers. How long since you slept? He asked. Really slept? Days, maybe longer. Arya's voice was getting softer, and he could see exhaustion creeping up on her now that they were finally warm and relatively safe. The hunters don't stop for rest. They just keep following the scent trail until they catch what they're hunting or something bigger catches them. Get some sleep. I'll keep watch. You need rest too. I'll sleep when you wake up. We can't both be unconscious at the same time, not with everything that's hunting us out there. She nodded, accepting the logic, even though he could see her reluctance to trust him with her safety while she was vulnerable. It was a reasonable concern, given everything she'd told him about her experiences with humans. But exhaustion won over caution, and within minutes of settling down on a patch of sand near the fire, she was unconscious. Ethan sat with his back against the cave wall, knife in hand, and listened to the storm build outside. The wind was howling now, and he could hear ice and debris being driven against the rocks with enough force to chip stone. Anyone trying to track them through this weather would have a miserable time of it, which was something to be grateful for. He found himself studying Arya's sleeping form, noting details he'd been too stressed to observe earlier. The blue of her skin wasn't uniform, but varied in shade from pale silver on her palms and the soles of her feet to deep sapphire along her spine and shoulders. Her hair wasn't purely silver either, but had threads of pale blue and white woven through it like frost on metal. Even unconscious, she maintained a fluid grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to challenging environments. She was beautiful, he realized, but in a way that was completely alien. Not human beauty translated to different features, but something entirely other. Something that made him aware of just how far from home he really was. The fire burned steadily through the night, the strange sand providing fuel that seemed to last indefinitely. Ethan dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time the wind shifted or a piece of ice struck the rocks outside the cave entrance. But nothing tried to approach their shelter, and gradually he began to relax. He was nearly asleep himself when Arya stirred, coming awake with the instant alertness of someone accustomed to danger. She sat up and looked around the cave, orienting herself, then focused on him with those unnerving silver eyes. How long was I unconscious? 6 hours, maybe 7. Hard to tell without seeing the Skasi. She nodded and moved to the cave entrance, peering out at the storm. It's getting worse. We won't be able to travel until this passes. How long will that take? Could be hours, could be days. This kind of weather system can sit over the mountains for a week or more. She returned to the fire and settled down across from him. Your turn to sleep. I'll watch. Ethan wanted to argue, but his body was making it clear that he was running on borrowed time. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rescue and escape was long gone, leaving him with muscles that ached and a mind that felt wrapped in cotton. Wake me if anything changes, he said, passing her the knife. She took the weapon and examined it with professional interest. This blade is well balanced. Military issue? Survival kit, standard equipment for researchers working in hostile environments. He stretched out on the sand, using his jacket as a pillow. though I don't think whoever designed the kit anticipated quite this level of hostility. Your people came to this world unprepared, Arya said, settling into a watchful crouch near the entrance. They saw ice and assumed it was empty. They found primitive life forms and assumed there was no intelligence. They detected energy signatures in the deep layers and assumed they could control whatever they found. What did they find? Something that should have been left alone. Something that had been sleeping in the ice for reasons our ancestors understood, even if yours didn't. Her voice was growing distant as sleep pulled him under. But your people never were good at listening to warnings. Ethan dreamed of silver eyes and blue fire, of voices calling across frozen wastelands, and something vast stirring in the darkness beneath the ice. He dreamed of his sister Jessica, lying in a hospital bed and looking at him with that same stubborn defiance he'd seen in Arya's face. In the dream, Jessica was trying to tell him something important, but her words were lost in the sound of wind and the distant howling of things that hunted in the storm. He woke to find Arya shaking his shoulder gently. The fire had burned down to embers, and pale light was filtering through the cave entrance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and ice. "Time to go," she said. "The search teams will start moving again as soon as the visibility improves." They extinguished the fire and gathered their meager supplies. The temperature outside was brutal, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, but the air was clear and still. Snow crunched under their feet as they climbed higher into the foothills, following paths that Arya seemed to know by instinct. The landscape was alien but beautiful, all crystalline formations and wind-carved sculptures of ice and stone. The twin suns cast everything in shades of gold and purple, and the silence was so complete that their breathing seemed unnaturally loud. They walked for hours without speaking, conserving energy and body heat for the climb ahead. The path grew steadily steeper and more treacherous, with loose rocks hidden under deceptive layers of snow and sudden drop-offs that appeared without warning. More than once, Ethan found himself grabbing for handholds on what turned out to be ice-covered stone, his gloves slipping on surfaces that looked solid but weren't. Arya moved through this terrain like it was her natural element, her bare feet finding purchase where his boots slipped and her balance never failing even on the narrowest ledges. She waited for him when he fell behind, helped him up when he stumbled, but never made him feel like a burden despite the obvious difference in their capabilities. "The beacon station is still 2 days away," she said during one of their rest stops, pointing toward a peak that seemed impossibly distant and high. "But there's another ancient site we can shelter in tonight, closer than the cave we used but more exposed to the wind." "What kind of site?" "Observatory, maybe, or some kind of communication facility. The ancients built it to take advantage of clear sight lines to the sky." She studied the clouds building on the horizon. "Another storm is coming. We need to reach it before the weather turns." They pushed harder through the afternoon, climbing steadily through air that grew thinner with each step. Ethan's lungs burned with the effort, and his heart hammered against his ribs as his body struggled to extract enough oxygen from the atmosphere. Arya seemed unaffected by the altitude, but then again, her physiology was adapted for harsh environments in ways his wasn't. The ancient site turned out to be a structure that defied easy description. It was built into the mountainside itself, with walls that seemed to flow seamlessly from natural rock formations. The entrance was a doorway carved to precise geometric specifications, flanked by columns covered in the same indecipherable symbols they'd seen in the cave. Inside, the space opened up into a series of chambers, connected by corridors that curved and branched in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The walls were covered in a material that felt warm to the touch, despite the cold outside, and some of the symbols glowed with a faint internal light that provided just enough illumination to navigate safely. "The ancients," Arya said as they explored the strange architecture. "No one knows what they looked like, but they clearly didn't think the same way we do. These spaces aren't designed for human or Kytherian comfort." "Kytherian?" "My people's name for ourselves. What your people call us is less respectful." They found a chamber that seemed designed for habitation, with raised platforms that might have been furniture and a depression in the floor that looked like it was meant to hold fire. The walls here were covered with what looked like star charts, showing constellations that might have been visible from this world thousands of years ago. "We should be safe here tonight," Arya said, settling onto one of the platforms. "The ancients built their structures to last, and this one has weathered everything this world could throw at it for millennia. Ethan examined the star charts while Arya prepared another fire with her seemingly inexhaustible supply of combustible sand. The constellations shown on the walls were definitely not the ones visible in the current night sky, suggesting either that the charts were incredibly old or that they showed views of space from somewhere else entirely. "Do you think they're still alive?" he asked. "The ancients, I mean. Somewhere maybe. Or maybe they evolved into something we wouldn't recognize as the same species." The fire caught, casting blue-white light across the carved walls. "My people have legends about the time before the ancients vanished. Stories about great ships that could travel between stars in the blink of an eye. About cities that floated in the clouds. About machines that could reshape matter with thought alone. Sounds like magic. Technology sufficiently advanced beyond our understanding might as well be magic." She fed more sand into the fire, keeping the flame steady. "But the legends also say the ancients grew too powerful, too separated from the natural world. They forgot that every action has consequences, that power without wisdom leads to destruction." "What happened to them?" "The legends don't agree. Some say they destroyed themselves in a war that lasted centuries. Others say they simply evolved beyond the need for physical existence and became something else entirely. A few suggest they're still here, sleeping in the deep places, waiting for the right conditions to return." The fire crackled, and outside the ancient structure, wind began to build as another storm system moved in. But the walls were thick, and the strange material they were made from seemed to absorb sound as well as conduct heat. Inside their shelter, the world felt distant and muted. "What about your people?" Ethan asked. "What are the Kytherian legends about humans?" Arya was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "We don't have legends about humans," she said finally. "You're too recent, too sudden. One day we were alone in our part of the galaxy, and the next day your ships were in our sky." She looked up at him, and her silver eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors. "But I think we're creating new legends now. Stories about what happens when two species meet and one of them has forgotten how to see the other as people rather than resources. And how do those stories end? I don't know yet. We're still writing them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm build outside. The ancient structure around them felt solid and eternal, as if it had always been part of the mountain and always would be. It was easy to imagine that they were the only living things for thousands of kilometers in any direction, alone on a world that belonged more to the past than the present. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "You've been asking me things all day. This is more personal." She gestured for him to continue. "When I opened that cage, when you had the chance to run, why did you fight beside me instead? You could have escaped while the hunters were focused on me." Arya considered the question, poking at the fire with a piece of metal she'd found somewhere in the ancient chamber. "Because you weren't trying to possess me. You were trying to free me. There's a difference, is there? To someone who's spent 3 years being hunted, bought, sold, and traded like property? Yes, there's a difference." She set the metal aside and looked at him directly. "Every other human I've encountered wanted something from me. My body, my knowledge, my labor, my compliance. You just wanted me to be free to make my own choices. Even if those choices didn't include helping me? Especially then. Freedom that comes with conditions isn't freedom at all." They prepared for sleep as they had the night before, taking turns to keep watch while the other rested. But this time, as Ethan settled down on one of the ancient platforms, he found himself thinking about debt and obligation, about the difference between helping someone because you wanted something from them and helping them because it was the right thing to do. He was beginning to understand that Arya's concept of life debt wasn't just about owing someone a favor. It was about recognizing that your choices could fundamentally alter another person's existence and accepting responsibility for the consequences of that alteration. By freeing her from the cage, he had changed the trajectory of her life in ways that would ripple forward through years and decades. The question was whether those changes would ultimately be positive or negative. Whether the freedom he'd given her would lead to safety and happiness, or just to a different kind of danger and suffering. He was still pondering this when sleep claimed him, and his dreams were full of silver eyes and ancient symbols that glowed with their own inner light. The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of climbing, resting, and climbing again. The path to the beacon station wound through increasingly treacherous terrain, across bridges that spanned chasms hundreds of meters deep and along ledges barely wide enough for single-file travel. The air grew thinner with each step, and the cold became a living thing that tried to steal the warmth from their bodies despite their constant movement. Twice they were forced to take shelter from storms that came without warning, hiding in caves or the ruins of other ancient structures until the wind died down enough to allow safe travel. Once they encountered a pack of predators that Arya identified as ice wolves, creatures the size of bears with pale blue fur and eyes like chips of frozen starlight. The wolves tracked them for several hours before apparently deciding they weren't worth the effort of hunting, but the experience left them both jumpy and hypervigilant. On the second night, they found shelter in what had clearly been some kind of ancient temple or shrine. The central chamber contained a raised dais surrounded by carved pillars, and the walls were covered with murals that showed tall, graceful figures engaged in activities that might have been religious ceremonies or scientific experiments. It was impossible to tell which, given how alien the depicted beings were. "Tomorrow we reach the beacon station," Arya said as they settled down beside their fire. "If it's still functional, if we can figure out how to use it, we might be able to send a signal to passing ships. And if we can't, then we die up here, probably from cold or altitude or the things that hunt in the high peaks." She said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "But at least we'll die free." That's supposed to be comforting. It is to me. I've spent 3 years running from people who wanted to cage me, use me, sell me like livestock. If I'm going to die, I'd rather it be on my own terms in a place like this than in some slaver's market or research facility. Ethan understood the sentiment, even if he didn't entirely share it. He'd rather live, even if that meant accepting limitations on his freedom. But then again, he'd never experienced the kind of systematic dehumanization that Arya had endured. His chains, such as they were, had been invisible and largely self-imposed. "What will you do if we get off this planet?" he asked. "Where will you go?" "There are colonies on the rim worlds where species don't matter as much as what you can contribute. Places where people ask what you can do, not what you are." She fed more sand into the fire, and the flames danced higher. "I have skills. Engineering, piloting, survival training. I can earn my keep wherever I end up. And the life debt will be paid when you're safe too." She looked at him across the fire. "What about you? What will you do when this is over?" It was a harder question than he'd expected. Before the research station's destruction, his life had been carefully planned and structured. Complete the mission, file the reports, accept the next assignment, climb the academic ladder until he reached a position where he could make decisions instead of just following orders. But that life belonged to a person who hadn't seen aliens sold in cages or watched soldiers discuss the relative value of individual lives versus mission objectives. It belonged to someone who hadn't learned what it felt like to trust your survival to another person's choices or to have someone else's life depend entirely on yours. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Everything I thought I wanted was based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong." Such as? That humans were basically decent people who made bad choices sometimes, instead of basically selfish people who occasionally did the right thing by accident. He poked at the fire with a piece of carved stone, watching sparks rise toward the ancient ceiling. That exploring the galaxy meant discovering wonders instead of finding new ways to repeat old mistakes. "You sound disappointed in your species." "Wouldn't you be?" Arya considered this. "My people aren't perfect either. We have our own history of conquest and exploitation, our own failures of empathy and imagination. The difference is that we never developed the technology to export our mistakes to other worlds. Maybe that's better. Maybe. Or maybe it just means we never had the chance to learn from interacting with truly different forms of consciousness." She shifted position on the ancient platform, wincing as the movement aggravated some injury he hadn't known she was carrying. "Your people and mine were more alike than different. Bipedal, oxygen-breathing, roughly similar intelligence and sensory capabilities. What happens when one of us encounters something truly alien? Something like the ancients, or the sleepers, or whatever's sleeping in the deep ice, or any of 1,000 other forms of life that might exist in the galaxy. The fire reflected in her eyes, making them seem to glow from within. Maybe that's when we'll find out what we're really capable of. When survival depends on cooperation instead of competition. They slept fitfully that night, both aware that the next day would determine whether their desperate gamble would pay off or whether they'd simply climbed higher than their pursuers before dying. The ancient temple around them felt like a fitting place for last chances and final prayers, though neither of them was sure who they might be praying to. Dawn came clear and brutally cold, with winds that cut through their improvised clothing like knives made of ice. The beacon station was visible now, a dark structure perched on the very peak of the mountain like a crown of metal and stone. The path to reach it was a narrow ledge carved into the cliff face with drops on both sides that disappeared into cloud and shadow. They climbed in silence, concentrating on placing each foot carefully and maintaining their balance against the wind that tried to pluck them from the mountainside and hurl them into the void below. More than once, Ethan found himself pressed against the cliff face with his eyes closed, waiting for a particularly vicious gust to pass before he dared to continue. The beacon station itself was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a complex of interconnected buildings that seemed to have grown organically from the mountain's peak. Like the other ancient structures they'd encountered, it was built from materials that showed no sign of age or weather damage, despite obviously having been exposed to the elements for millennia. The entrance was sealed by what looked like a solid wall of the same strange metal that formed the building's walls. But as they approached, symbols began to glow along the surface, and with a sound like distant thunder, the wall began to split apart like opening flower petals. Motion sensors, Arya said, studying the now open entrance. They're responding to our presence. Is that good or bad? We're about to find out. The interior of the beacon station was a maze of corridors and chambers filled with machinery that hummed with quiet energy. Everything was scaled for beings roughly their size, suggesting that the ancients had been humanoid in basic body plan, even if they thought in ways that neither human nor Caitherian minds could easily follow. They found the central control chamber after nearly an hour of exploration. It was a circular room dominated by a raised platform covered in what looked like crystal formations arranged in complex geometric patterns. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with displays that showed streaming data in scripts and symbols that meant nothing to either of them. I can't read any of this, Ethan said, studying the nearest display panel. Neither can I, but some of these symbols look familiar. Arya approached the central platform cautiously as if expecting it to respond to her presence the way the entrance had. My people have legends about artifacts left by the ancients, devices that could be activated by touch or thought rather than mechanical manipulation. You think this is one of those devices? Only one way to find out. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on one of the larger crystal formations. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crystal began to glow with the same blue-white light as their fires, and the humming of machinery throughout the station grew noticeably louder. The display panels around the room flickered and changed, showing new patterns of symbols and what looked like star charts, similar to the ones they'd seen in the temple. But these charts were dynamic, showing movement and change, tracking objects that move through space in real time. It's responding to you, Ethan said. To both of us, I think. The system is trying to establish communication. Arya kept her hand on the crystal, and gradually the displays began to stabilize into patterns that were almost comprehensible. Look, those symbols there, they're repeating in regular sequences. That might be mathematical constants or physical laws. Ethan studied the displays, trying to find patterns that might indicate how to operate the beacon function. There, Mighty said, pointing to a panel that showed what looked like concentric circles with pulsing lights. That looks like it might represent communication ranges or signal strength. Arya moved to another crystal formation, this one smaller but more intricately faceted. When she touched it, the display Ethan had identified began to pulse more rapidly, and new symbols appeared around the edges. It's asking for input, Sharon said. Destination coordinates, maybe, or message content. They worked together for the better part of an hour, touching different crystals and watching the displays respond, gradually building up a rudimentary understanding of the interface. It was like learning to speak a new language without vocabulary or grammar, relying entirely on context and repetition to divine meaning from alien symbols. Finally, they managed to activate what was clearly the beacon's transmission system. Energy built in the crystal formations with a sound like singing crystal, and displays around the room showed expanding circles that presumably represented the signal's propagation through space. Now what? Ethan asked. Now we wait and see if anyone's listening. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes of their transmission, new symbols began appearing on the displays, clearly representing incoming signals from multiple sources. The ancient beacon system was sophisticated enough to analyze and categorize these responses, showing what looked like ship identifications and estimated arrival times. 3 different vessels, Arya said, interpreting the display data as best she could. One will be here in hours, not days. The others will take longer to reach this system. Which one do we want to signal back? She studied the ship identifications, comparing them to symbols on other displays that might represent registry information or cargo manifests. This one, she said finally, pointing to the vessel with the shortest estimated arrival time. The symbols suggest it's a free trader, not military or corporate owned. They sent their response signal, hoping that whoever received it would understand that they were requesting pickup rather than trying to lure ships into some kind of trap. Then they settled down to wait, monitoring the displays for any sign that their message had been understood and acknowledged. What if they don't come? Ethan asked as the hours passed. Then we try to signal one of the other ships, or we wait for more responses to our original beacon transmission. Arya was still touching one of the crystals, maintaining her connection to the ancient system. But I think they'll come. Free traders make their living by taking calculated risks, and rescuing stranded people can be profitable if those people are grateful enough. And if they're slavers pretending to be free traders, then we'll find out just how well this ancient technology works as a weapon. Late in the afternoon, the displays showed a new signal, much stronger than the others and getting stronger rapidly. A ship was approaching the planet, and it was broadcasting identification codes that matched the free trader they'd contacted. They're here, Arya said, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded hopeful rather than simply determined. They're requesting landing coordinates. The beacon station provided those coordinates automatically, designating a flat area near the base of the mountain that could accommodate a small ship. The display showed the vessel's descent trajectory and estimated landing time. 2 hours until touchdown, Ethan said, reading the symbols as best he could. We should start heading down. They made their way back through the ancient structure to the entrance, where the wall had already begun to close behind them. The trip down the mountain was faster than the climb-up had been, but no less dangerous. Loose rocks and ice made every step treacherous, and the thin air left them both gasping with exertion. But they reached the designated landing area just as a sleek ship settled onto the snow with a whisper of repulsors and a cloud of steam from melting ice. The vessel was smaller than Ethan had expected, more of a courier ship than a freighter, but it looked well-maintained and bore the scars of honest use rather than neglect or abuse. A hatch opened in the ship's side and a figure emerged wearing environment gear suited for the planet's harsh conditions. Human in general outline, but when the helmet came off, the face revealed was clearly neither human nor Catherian. Green-scaled skin, large eyes adapted for low-light conditions, and gill slits along the neck that suggested an aquatic evolutionary background. "You're the ones who sent the distress signal?" the being asked in accented but understandable English. "That's us," Ethan replied. "We need transport off this planet. I am Captain Vex of the merchant vessel Wandering Star. Passage costs 50 credits per person, payable in advance or in trade goods of equivalent value." The captain studied them with obvious interest. "You look like you've had a difficult time." "We don't have credits," Arya said, "but we have information that might be valuable. Data about human military operations in this system and the location of ancient ruins that contain functioning technology." Captain Vex's large eyes grew even larger. "Ancient technology? You mean the precursor artifacts? If that's what you call the ruins left by whoever lived here before any of our species arrived, then yes. That information could be very valuable indeed. Valuable enough to cover passage to wherever you want to go, and perhaps a bit extra for expenses." The captain gestured toward the ship's hatch. "Come aboard." and we'll discuss terms once we're clear of this frozen wasteland. They climbed aboard the ship with relief that was almost overwhelming. The interior was warm and dry with artificial gravity that made walking feel normal again after days of struggling with uneven terrain. Captain Vex led them to a small but comfortable passenger compartment and provided them with hot food and clean clothing while the ship lifted off and climbed toward orbit. "Where do you want to go?" the captain asked once they were safely in space. "I can take you to any of a dozen systems within a few days' travel or arrange connections to more distant destinations." Ethan looked at Arya, realizing that they'd never actually discussed what would happen if they successfully escaped the planet. They'd been so focused on survival that the question of what came next had never seemed relevant. "Somewhere we can disappear," Arya said finally. "Somewhere species don't matter as much as what you can contribute." "Ah, the Rim colonies. Yes, I know several places that fit that description." Captain Vex consulted a datapad, scrolling through what looked like star charts and trade routes. "There's a system called Sanctuary, about 10 days from here. Mixed population, minimal government interference, plenty of opportunities for people with useful skills." "That sounds perfect," Ethan said. As the ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, carrying them away from the frozen world that had nearly killed them both, Ethan found himself thinking about debt and obligation, about the choices that had led them to this moment and the choices that still lay ahead. Arya was sitting across from him in the passenger compartment, looking out through a porthole at the star-streaked void of hyperspace. She seemed more relaxed than he'd ever seen her, as if a weight he hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "The debt is paid. Paid," she said without turning away from the window. "You're safe now, free to make your own choices about what comes next." "So are you." "Yes." She looked at him then, and her silver eyes held something he hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, but possibility. "So what will you choose?" It was still a hard question, but now he thought he might have an answer. "I think I'd like to see what's possible when people work together instead of against each other, when they choose cooperation over competition." "That sounds like a good choice. What about you?" Arya smiled, and this time there was definitely hope in her expression. "I think I'd like to help build something better than what we're leaving behind. Something that proves different species can create new kinds of civilization together." "That sounds like a choice I could live with too." Outside the porthole, stars wheeled in patterns that neither of their homeworlds had ever seen, and ahead of them lay possibilities that neither of their species had yet imagined. They were free now, both of them, to discover what those possibilities might become. And for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, that felt like enough.